Shalom. My name is Richard Harvey, and I'm speaking to you from just outside London, England. I'm very glad to be with you today, and we will have 3 sessions on who is a Messianic Jew. I'm Jewish myself, a Jewish disciple of Jesus. He is my rabbi, and I will be trying to explain in these next 3 sessions just what that means. If you have a computer, you'll be watching me online. If not, you may have access to these slides and my discussion. What I'm going to do is share my screen and look at the question, who is a Messianic Jew? You can see there a picture of a Messianic Jewish rabbi holding the scrolls of the law, the Torah, wearing a Jewish prayer shawl, and in an atmosphere, an attitude of worship. So we're looking at the testimony, the history, and the theology of Jewish disciples of Jesus. If you'd like a copy of the slides, or if you have further questions or comments, do email me at r.harvey@allnations.ac.uk. The sessions that we're going to have, the first one will be personal testimony. The second will be the history of Messianic Jews. And the third will be the theology of Messianic Jews. And you can see in the picture here, a picture by the famous Russian Jewish artist, Mark Chagall, painting a picture of Jesus. It's called The White Crucifixion. And I will discuss this painting later, as it reflects so much how Jewish people think about Jesus and how Jewish disciples of Jesus, Messianic Jews, also see him as one of us and alongside his suffering people. Each session will have 2 parts, 30 minutes each, and that will give you time to pause for discussion and comments in your groups, or if you have a question for me, please put it in the chat if we're online, or email it to me, and I will try and get back to you. So let's begin with my own personal story. And I'm going to use what's called a storyboard approach. A storyboard is a way of telling a story which shortens it so that it can all be done on one piece of paper. And in mission, I often think that we are sharing 3 stories at the same time. We are trying to bring together the story of God, how God is at work in the world, how he has been at work in Jesus the Messiah, and how he wants to work in our lives. We bring his story together with our personal story, how God has become real to us, and how Jesus has shown himself to be our Messiah, Lord and Saviour. And then we try to bring those 2 stories together with my neighbour's story. Who is my neighbour? Everybody. But for effective mission, we want to bring together these 3 stories so that we meet people where they are, and we overlap their story with my story within God's story, just as Jesus commanded his disciples in Matthew 28 to make disciples of all nations, teaching them to obey all the things that I have commanded you. There is I, that is Jesus. There is you, that's disciples like you and me, and then them, the disciples who will arise from all nations. So when I begin my story, as a Jewish person, I actually need to begin with the Bible. Now, we don't have time today to talk about the whole story of the Bible, but here it is simply illustrated as a storyboard in 16 scenes. And if I use my pointer, you'll see that in the beginning, God made the earth and the heavens and all creation. And then the second slide is the apple, which symbolizes the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil that Adam and Eve were told not to eat, but they did. And so sin came into the world. The third slide is the four patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And it symbolizes the call of Abraham and the beginning of the pilgrim people of God who had no home of their own. They wandered through the land of Canaan, went down to Egypt, but no home of their own. But they were the precursors for the story of Israel. The fourth scene is, of course, Moses parting the waters of the Red Sea, which tells us about the escape of the children of Israel from slavery in Egypt towards the promised land. And the fifth scene on the top right there is the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness because of their lack of faith. And only Caleb and Joshua were to enter the land in faith. And then the second row, the walls of Jericho there. And Jericho was the place where Joshua managed to bring the 12 tribes into the promised land. And after the successful fall of the walls of Jericho, he was able to divide the land for the different tribes. And then the two arrows going round in circles talks about the period of the judges, where everyone did what was right in their own eyes, and there was no king in the land. And of course, Judges is a terrible example for us of sin and yet God's salvation and forgiveness. And then the crown in the middle there is the three kings of the united monarchy, Saul, David, and Solomon. The small megaphone that you can see underneath the crown are the prophets calling the kings back to righteousness and living under the covenant. Then the next slide, the man with tears, is the weeping prophet Jeremiah. And of course, this symbolizes the exile in Babylon that the Jewish people were sent into because they did not live according to God's covenant purposes. Again, the prophets are giving them a message of both judgment and consolation and hope. And then the bottom right slide, the middle slide with the arrow turning around, is both the return of the Jewish people from exile in Babylon back to the land and the return of God's face towards the Jewish people as they returned after 70 years in exile in Babylon from the years 586 to roughly 520. And then they were encouraged to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, and wait for the coming of the Messiah. Then on the bottom left, you have what often is called 400 years of silence. Shh, they are waiting for the Messiah to come. But of course, if you know anything about Jewish people, you know that Jewish people don't just stand and wait. We sit and discuss all the time. So the building of the synagogue, the rebuilding of the temple, the codification of the law under Ezra the scribe, and all this was preparing for the birth of Jesus. And the four books with the cross symbolizes the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the story of Jesus and his disciples, ending with his cross and his rising from the dead. And then the new heart, which you see in the bottom there in the middle row, the bottom row in the middle, is the coming of the Holy Spirit and the birth of the church and the beginnings of mission to all nations, not just to Israel. And then the man talking to his neighbor and the people in the bottom final slide, but one is going and making disciples of all nations. And that's where we are now. We are in the period between the coming of the Holy Spirit and the founding of the church, the making of disciples of all nations. And the final picture there, the wonderful new heavens and new earth, the number 2 there symbolizes a new creation. All things will be made new, and the return of Jesus. Now, for me as a Jewish person, The story of the Bible is my story and my family history. And when I brought up my children, we celebrate every year the Passover, and we talk about our great, 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 great grandparents who celebrated Passover. And we go right back to the story of Abraham and even further to the creation of the world, because as Jewish people, we have very long memories, and we have to include the story of the Bible in our own personal story. And then for me to bring you up to date with my own personal story, you can see that I've tried to express this. I'm not a great artist, but if I was a Hollywood director making a film, I'd want this in the storyboard as the prologue. Before I was born, there was the Big Bang, the creation, whether you think of it as millions of years ago or thousands of years ago, we were created. And then you have a short picture of the Garden of Eden with an apple on the right-hand side, and then Abraham, and then a map of Israel with the Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea, and the River Jordan, and then generations and generations. And then you have a Nazi swastika, the symbol of persecution of my people by the Germans in the Second World War under Adolf Hitler, who tried to destroy my people and was unsuccessful in his genocide, but managed to destroy a third of the Jewish people, including many of my relatives who come from Europe, from Germany and from Poland. And then we get to my story. And again, I've done a storyboard approach. I've put my story in 12 scenes there. And if I go through them briefly, I will say that my family began in Germany. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was a peddler who had a horse and cart and went to Essen. And there he had many in his family who were successful as the first Jews who were able to practice trades in Germany. When I tell this story, by the way, you need to hear that history and our culture and our identity is very much wrapped up in our own personal stories. And my great-grandfather was Solomon Hertz Hirschland. Hirschland means the land of the deer, and there is the symbol of the deer. And the Hirschland family were successful merchants, bankers, traders, and doctors in a small town in Germany called Essen, which is in the north of Germany. And my great-great-grandfather was Moses Hirschland, who was a doctor of medicine. There's even an article about him on Wikipedia. And he was one of the first Jews in Germany to be able to get a secular education, because up until that time, Jews were not allowed to get secular education. He was the first Jewish graduate of the Prussian Royal High School in Essen. He was the private doctor to Alfred Krupp. Now, if you know anything about German industry or technology, Krupp is an important name. They made massive technological changes. They rearmed the German army before the Second World War. Today they make lifts and coffee machines and all sorts of technical and industrial equipment. He was a personal friend of Alfred Krupp, but Alfred Krupp was also involved in helping the Nazis, the National Socialists who fought for Hitler. He was instrumental in helping them develop Zyklon gas, which was used to kill Jewish people in the concentration camps in Germany and Poland. Moses Hirschland, of course, died before this, and he was a distinguished German citizen. And then my great-grandfather, that's Richard Hirschland, was brought up in the town of Essen in North Germany. That was the family home. This was the family bank, because his brother Simon Hirschland was a banker who used his bank to bring money and investment into Germany after the First World War, so that Germany could help rebuild its industry and also its war effort. And now we've lost the home and we've lost the bank, but there is a public square named after the family called Hirschlandplatz, Hirschland Place. And we even have an underground station. And this is some of my cousins who visited Germany, I do regularly, at the underground station, Hirschland Place. Now, I would personally, and this is my own Jewish humour, I would prefer the house and the bank. But of course, these were all taken from us, and my family had to leave Germany or they would be killed. And during this time, my great-grandfather came to England with two of his brothers, and they were called the Brothers Hirschland in London. And in the synagogue in Essen, it's still standing today, you can visit it, there is a plaque which shows who the founders of the synagogue are, the place where Jewish people worship. And also there is a note of those who gave money for the building of the synagogue, just as the centurion in the Gospels was a supporter of the Jewish people, and that's why the leaders of the synagogue come to Jesus to ask for healing for his servant. And so my brothers in my great-grandfather and his brothers in London were supporting the building of the synagogue. But I don't know if you're aware that in 1938, all the synagogues in Germany and the homes, the offices and the shops owned by Jewish people were burned. And this was called Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. And everybody had to leave or they would be sent, deported on trains to the concentration camps, places of forced labor, where many Jewish people were put to death. And in fact, one of my relatives, another Hirschland, Albert Hirschland, who even became a Lutheran, a Christian, and the pastor who baptized him was put in prison during the war for having contact with this Jew. He was a cousin of my great-great-grandfather, but he was put on trial, and this is a picture of the Nazi propaganda magazine, Die Stürmer, the Stormer, which showed that he accused him in a 16-page special issue, accused him of being a Rassenschande, a race defiler. They made up a completely false charge that he was having sexual relations with his students. He taught in a secretarial college for training secretaries. And they said that he was having sexual relations, a typical Nazi accusation against Jews. He was put on trial and found guilty, and he was sent to Auschwitz, the concentration camp, and he was murdered. So you can hear in my family history a mixture of survival and of suffering. And in Jewish life, we often have joy with an oi. In other words, we have great things to celebrate. We've survived for more than 4,000, 5,000 years. And yet we've often been persecuted for just being Jewish. And so I come now to my own background. My great-grandfather, Richard Hirschland, I'm named after him. His son was Sidney Moses Hirschland, my grandfather, named after Moses Hirschland, the doctor. And my father was born Anthony Adolf Hirschland. And he died a few years ago. By the way, my grandfather is the tall young man standing on the left-hand side behind his grandfather, Richard Hirschland there. And so my father was born Anthony Adolf Hirschland, but of course Adolf was the name of Adolf Hitler, the one who tried to kill all the Jewish people. So my grandfather changed our family name from Hirschland to Harvey. And he also got rid of the name Adolf, and my father never used the name Adolf, but only the name Tony. And that was in 1938, just before the Second World War, when it was a dangerous time to have a Jewish name or a German name, especially if you lived in England. So instead of the German name Hirschland, my father became Harvey, and I too. And then my mother's side of the family, again, you learn so much from family history. And while I'm sharing my personal testimony, I cannot leave out my own family background. That's my mother there with her grandfather, Edward Weiss. Now, Edward was actually born Elias or Elijah. The Hebrew name Elijah in Yiddish is Elias. He was born in Poland in 1874. And the house he's born is still standing, and it's now an ice cream parlor. I went there and said, my great-grandfather was born here. Please, can I have the house back? And they said, no, but here's a free ice cream. Very nice ice cream. And he came to England from Poland, but of course the Jewish people in Poland had been there for hundreds, almost thousands of years. They settled in Poland in 1330 in the small town of Tarnow, which is near Krakow. But they were rounded up and murdered in the 1930s, in 1939. Half of the population of that small town were Jewish. They were all murdered or deported to concentration camps. And the bottom picture is of the synagogue cemetery, where thousands of Jewish people are buried, many of them without gravestones because they were just killed en masse. And the synagogue, the building where they worshipped, was destroyed. And all that is left now, you can see in the picture there, is the structure where the Torah scroll, the book of the 5 books of Moses, would be stored and read. And the rest of the synagogue was destroyed. So he came from Poland. He escaped before the Second World War. He came to England, and there he took on the name Edward, because Edward was the name of the king at the time. And he reinvented himself as an English gentleman. And then his daughter was my grandmother, Elaine Weiss, or Weiss, which means white. And my mother was Margaret Falk. That is his passport and his certificate of becoming a British citizen. So I went from my family tree of the Hirschlands and the thousands of years of history in Germany and Poland to now being a 3rd generation British Jewish disciple of Jesus. And my story is told in this book, But I'm Jewish. A Jew for Jesus tells his story, and that's available to purchase or for download. I will give you the link later on. So I'm going to move on in a few moments, but I will also give you a break to my own personal story. But before I do that, let me just summarize what I've told you about my family. My family are a very ancient family. We stretch back thousands of years to Abraham. And many of us can trace our ancestry right back through the centuries. So I could show you more family trees that go back hundreds of years to the Middle Ages. And then by Jewish tradition, we trace our families back. I meet many people who say, perhaps I'm Jewish. And I would always say, do you have a family tree? If you have a family tree, that is a very good place to start discovering if you are Jewish. If you're not having a family tree, but there is a history or a tradition of Jewish descent in your family, test your DNA. Many Jewish people look at the DNA findings today as well. But of course, you don't have to be Jewish to believe in Jesus, and Jesus is for everyone. So let me begin in these next few minutes to tell you my story. And again, I've storyboarded my journey into 12 sessions. And may I suggest that if you ever want to tell your story in a creative way, you would make a storyboard like this that you could share with a friend at a cafe over a coffee or wherever you meet somebody. And I will tell my story beginning with my birth. So I was born in 1956, the 10th of October. And in Jewish tradition, 8 days after you are born, If you're a male, you are circumcised. Your foreskin is removed. There is a special ceremony. And the word in Hebrew for this ceremony of circumcision is the word bris or berit, which means the covenant. Because every Jewish male, when they are born, are circumcised on the 8th day to show that they are a member of the covenant people, the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, according to Jewish law, if your mother is Jewish, you are born Jewish, or if you go through a conversion ceremony. But in the Bible, Jewish descent often goes through the father. It is the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that are Jewish, but they are also born through the line of Sarah, and then Rebecca, and then the wives of Joseph. So I was circumcised on the 8th day of my birth by a Jewish doctor who was a friend of the family. His name was Morris Steen. And they said the special blessing over me and a prayer that I would grow up to be a good member of the covenant of Abraham, to practice the principles of God's law, the Torah, and to show a life of good deeds, and to come eventually to marriage under a Jewish marriage canopy, and so on. And I don't remember a bit of it. But my mother, like every Jewish mother, it always affects the mother more because they don't want to see their sons suffer. And you can see there on my picture, I have 3 brothers, all younger than me, and we all went through the same ceremony of circumcision, and then we were brought up to go to synagogue. Now, I was brought up to go to a synagogue near me, just south of London, near Rains Park. And I was, at the age of 13, my parents said to me, are you going to have your bar mitzvah? Bar mitzvah means a son of the commandment. And it's a phrase which symbolizes the ceremony where at the age of 13, if you're a boy, and at the age of 12, if you're a girl, you take on yourself the responsibilities of being a good Jew, of keeping the Torah. In Jewish tradition, when you are 13, you become a man. Your father is no longer responsible for your sins. You are responsible, and you can even buy a house or start a business, or even if you want, get married. Of course, most Jewish people don't do that today, but that is the Jewish tradition. But I didn't believe in God. And I didn't want to go through the ceremony where I say, Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah, blessed are you, O Lord our God, who gives us the Torah, and read from the scroll of the law. That's a picture of me with the pointer reading the scrolls of the law. And of course, if you're a bar mitzvah, you have lots of presents and a big party. But I didn't believe in God. And I didn't want to go through a ceremony that I didn't believe in. I thought that would be a hypocritical thing to do. So I said to my parents, I don't want to have a service. I want to find my own way. And my parents said, because they were very tolerant and they always encouraged us to make our own decisions and our own choices, okay, you must do what you think is right. Now we've come to the end of 30 minutes of my presentation, so I'm going to pause here and I'm going to give you time for a break or discussion, and we will resume shortly. Thank you for your attention.